Overtrading doesn't start with the 10th trade of the day. It doesn't start with the reckless one, the one you screenshot later as evidence of how far you fell. By the time you're on that trade, the actual event that caused this has already been over for hours, sometimes days. Almost everyone gets the timeline wrong, and getting the timeline wrong is exactly why the same trader falls into this same trap over and over, no matter how many times they promise themselves it won't happen again. Today, I'm going to reconstruct this like a crime scene. Not the symptom, the origin, where overtrading actually begins, how it moves through your account undetected, and the exact moment it becomes something you can no longer talk yourself out of. If you've ever sat there at 2 p.m. with 4 open positions you can't fully explain, wondering how you got there, this is for you. Here's the uncomfortable part first. It's not boredom, it's not FOMO. Those are real, but they're the symptoms everyone points a camera at because they're visible and dramatic. The actual mechanism is quieter, it happens earlier, and almost nobody in this space talks about it because it requires walking backward through your own week instead of just your own afternoon. Let me tell you about 2 traders, Daniel and Anna, both trading the same instrument, same account size, same broker, same month. Daniel had a good week. 4 trades, 3 winners, tight execution, exactly the kind of week that gets held up as proof a system works. Then on Thursday, a setup he liked didn't quite meet his criteria. He took it anyway. It won. Friday, 2 more setups that were close enough. Both won. By the following Wednesday, Daniel had taken 11 trades in a single session, most of which had no clear reason to exist beyond the market felt like it was moving. He gave back 3 weeks of gains in 4 hours. Anna had a rough week, 2 losses in a row, both textbook, both exactly by her rules, both just didn't work out, which happens. On Thursday, a setup came along that didn't meet her criteria. She looked at it for a long moment, wrote, "No trade, doesn't qualify in her log," and closed her laptop. She took 0 trades that day. Friday, 1 qualifying setup. She took it, it won, but even if it hadn't, her week would have looked identical from a process standpoint. Here's what should bother you about this. Daniel's overtrading week was triggered by winning too much, not by losing. That single fact breaks almost every popular explanation for overtrading you've ever heard. And it's exactly why we need to go further back than revenge trading to actually understand this. Let's build the real timeline, not the moment you clicked buy on the trade you regret. The full sequence, stage by stage, starting well before that. Stage 1 is what I'll call the compression phase, and it's the part nobody notices because it looks identical to discipline. This is a stretch of time, usually several days to a couple weeks, where you are following your rules well. You're passing on setups that don't qualify, you're sizing correctly, from the outside and even to yourself. This looks like exactly what good trading is supposed to look like. But here's what's actually happening underneath that surface. Every time you correctly pass on a trade that doesn't meet your criteria, you're not just avoiding a bad trade. You're also suppressing an urge, and that urge doesn't disappear just because you didn't act on it. It compresses. Think of it less like willpower and more like pressure building behind a valve that's been closed correctly trade after trade, day after day. The valve is doing exactly its job, but pressure behind a valve doing its job is still pressure, and it accumulates whether or not you're tracking it. This is the stage almost every trader misreads completely, because it feels like their best stretch of trading. It often is their best stretch of trading, by the numbers. That's precisely the problem. Good weeks build the same compression that bad weeks do, sometimes more, because a winning streak adds a second ingredient on top of the suppressed urge. Proof. Proof that your judgment is sharp right now. Proof that becomes very easy to extend 1 inch past where it should stop. Losing weeks compress differently, and it's worth naming both versions because most people only recognize one. A rough stretch where your rules keep you out of a trade, or 2 that would have worked, builds a different kind of pressure, closer to frustration than confidence. That version feels obvious, and it's the one every overtrading video already covers. The confident version, the one Daniel experienced, is far more dangerous precisely because it doesn't feel like pressure at all. It feels like competence, Nobody sits inside a winning week thinking, I am currently compressing an urge I'll release irrationally in 3 days. They think, I've finally figured this out. Both thoughts can be true about the trading itself and false about what's happening underneath it. There's a physical analogy worth sitting with here. A spring that's been compressed correctly, held exactly where it should be by a mechanism doing its job, still stores the same energy whether it's been held there for an hour or for 2 weeks. The mechanism holding it doesn't get credit for the energy not existing. It only gets credit for where that energy eventually goes and for how much of it has built up by the time something finally lets go. Stage 2 is the trigger event, and this is the part people think is the actual start of overtrading, when it's really just the release valve for something that was already fully pressurized. The trigger is almost always small, a setup that's 90% there instead of 100, a slightly early entry on a pattern that's still forming, news that moves price fast enough to feel like an opportunity you can't afford to miss. The trigger event is not the cause. It's the spark, not the fuel. If you removed this specific trigger, another one, equally small, would have shown up within a day or two and done exactly the same job. Because the compression was already sitting there fully loaded, waiting for literally anything plausible to release it. This is why traders often can't explain, even to themselves, why that particular trade was the one that broke the dam. It wasn't special. It was just next. Stage 3 is what I call the justification collapse, and this is the part that separates someone having one impulsive trade from someone spiraling into a genuine overtrading session. After the trigger trade, your brain needs a story that makes taking it feel consistent with being a disciplined trader. Because the alternative, admitting you broke your own rule for no good reason, is uncomfortable in a way most people will do almost anything to avoid. So the story gets built in real time. The setup was close enough. I'm just using good judgment instead of being rigid. The market's clearly trending. This is different. My normal rules are too conservative for a day like today. Notice, these stories aren't stupid. They sound like reasonable trading logic. That's exactly why they work as justification. A story has to sound plausible to do its job, and these ones almost always do. Here's the mechanism that makes stage 3 so dangerous. Once you've successfully justified breaking a rule once, the bar for justifying the next break drops. Not because you're weak-willed, because your brain now has a template, a working story format that got approved once already, and it reuses that template faster and with less resistance the second time. This is why the gap between trade 2 and trade 3 of an overtrading session is almost always shorter than the gap between trade 1 and trade 2. You're not deciding fresh each time. You're running the same approved story on a shorter loop. Go back to Daniel's Thursday. His first justification, the one for trade 5 in his week, was actually fairly specific. The setup was close enough, and he had genuine reasons to believe the criteria he used was slightly too conservative for that particular instrument. That's a real trading opinion, even if it turned out to be the first domino. By his 9th trade that same session, the justification had shrunk down to something closer to, this looks similar to the last one that worked. Notice how much smaller that story became. It's not that Daniel got dumber over 4 hours. It's that the template got reused so many times that the story required to greenlight the next trade needed less and less actual content to feel sufficient. Stage 4 is tolerance collapse, and this is the stage where a session stops looking anything like your normal trading and starts looking like something almost nobody recognizes as themselves afterward. This is where Daniel's 11 trades in a session comes from. Each successful justification doesn't just approve the current trade, it recalibrates what counts as an acceptable setup at all. Your filter, the actual line in your head between this qualifies and this doesn't, physically moves lower with each trade you take that falls just outside it. By trade 7 or 8 in one of these sessions, a trader is often taking positions that would have looked absurd to them at the start of the same session, and it doesn't feel absurd in the moment, because the filter that would have flagged it as absurd has already been quietly recalibrated 3 or 4 times in the preceding hour. This is the stage where people describe feeling almost like they were watching themselves from outside their own body, clicking buttons they can't fully account for later. That description isn't dramatic exaggeration. It's an accurate report of what a collapsed filter actually feels like from the inside. Stage 5, the final one, is what I call the accounting fog, and it's specific to overtrading in a way that separates it from a single bad trade. Because the session involved so many rapid decisions, the trader genuinely loses accurate track of their real exposure. They know they're in a lot of trades, but the actual math, total risk across all open positions, correlation between those positions, how much of the account is actually exposed at once, becomes fuzzy in a way it never is during normal, slower trading. This is why overtrading sessions produce losses that feel disproportionate even to the trader experiencing them. It's not that any single trade was catastrophic. It's that 5 or 6 moderately risky positions were opened simultaneously without anyone, including the trader themselves, tracking the combined exposure. The fog isn't a side effect. It's the mechanism that turns a bad afternoon into a catastrophic one. So that's the full anatomy. Compression, built during your best-looking stretches. Trigger, small, and almost interchangeable. Justification, a plausible story that lowers the bar for the next one. Tolerance, collapse, where your filter itself relocates lower with each trade. Accounting fog, where total exposure becomes invisible exactly when it matters most. 5 stages, and by the time you're aware anything is wrong, you're usually somewhere around stage 4, wondering how you got there. When the honest answer is, you got there gradually, from a starting point that looked like your best trading, not your worst. Now let's talk about what actually interrupts this. Because the standard advice, just be more disciplined, fails precisely because it's aimed at stage 3 or 4, when the actual leverage point is back at stage 1, before pressure ever builds in the first place. Shift 1 targets compression directly. Instead of only tracking wins and losses, track past setups explicitly, in writing, every single day, even on days you take 0 trades. Anna's habit of writing "no trade doesn't qualify" wasn't just record keeping. It was releasing the pressure through a controlled valve of its own, a small acknowledgement that the urge existed and was noticed, rather than letting it silently accumulate unspoken. Traders who log their passes, not just their trades, report the compression phase feeling noticeably less charged, because the urge got a place to go that wasn't a live position. Shift 2 targets the trigger stage. Build a mandatory pause, not a suggestion, a hard rule between any setup that falls outside your defined criteria and the decision to take it anyway. Even 60 seconds changes the outcome more than people expect, because the justification story in stage 3 needs momentum to form convincingly, and a forced pause breaks that momentum before the story fully assembles itself. Some professional trading desks build this exact pause into their systems mechanically, a required confirmation step that adds friction specifically to the type of trade that falls outside pre-approved criteria. Shift 3 targets the justification collapse directly. Before taking any trade that doesn't meet your written criteria, you must write the specific rule you're breaking and why, in one sentence, before you click the button, not after. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but it works precisely because it forces the justification into explicit, examinable language, instead of letting it run as a vague, comfortable feeling in the background. A story that has to be written down concretely is far harder to convince yourself of than a feeling that gets to stay comfortably unexamined. Shift 4 targets tolerance collapse specifically. Set a hard, absolute cap on trades per session, decided the night before, with 0 renegotiation once the session starts. The number itself matters less than the fact that it cannot move once trading begins. This directly prevents the filter relocation that happens in stage 4, because the cap isn't measuring quality of setups anymore. It's measuring a fixed quantity that was decided by a calmer version of you the night before, who wasn't inside an active session and recalibrating in real time. Shift 5 targets the accounting fog. At any point you have more than one position open, you must be able to state your combined risk across all open positions in a single number, out loud or in writing, before adding anything new. If you can't produce that number immediately, that inability is itself the signal to stop, because it means the fog has already started, whether or not you feel it yet. Consider what this would have looked like inside Daniel's session in real time. Trade 6 wouldn't have been evaluated on its own merits at all, the way it was in the moment. It would have been evaluated against a running total that, by Trade 6, already included 4 other open positions with meaningful overlapping exposure to the same instrument. Stated out loud, that number alone likely would have stopped the session cold, not because Daniel lacked discipline, but because the fog that let him not notice the combined number is precisely what Shift 5 is designed to strip away. Fog only works in silence. It doesn't survive being spoken out loud as an actual figure. Here's where this becomes about more than tactics. The traders who eventually escape this pattern for good stop thinking of themselves as people trying to resist overtrading in the moment, and start thinking of themselves as people who manage the conditions that produce the urge long before it arrives. That's a completely different job. Resisting an urge in real time at stage 3 or 4 is fighting a battle that's already mostly lost, because compression has already built and a plausible story has already half formed. Managing the conditions means intervening back at stage 1 before there's anything to resist at all. Daniel eventually rebuilt his process around exactly this. He started logging past setups the same day he stopped his overtrading spiral. And within a few months, his good weeks stopped functioning as fuel for his bad ones. His trading got quieter, genuinely quieter, in a way that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the version of trading he'd been doing before. All those winning streaks that used to feel like momentum, and now just look, in hindsight, like pressure with good PR. What actually changed for Daniel wasn't his strategy. His entries looked almost identical to the ones he'd been taking for over a year. What changed was the question he asked himself at the end of every session. He used to ask, "Did I make good trades today?" Which is a question that only looks backward at outcomes already locked in. He started asking, "What did I suppress today, and did I write it down?" Which is a question that looks forward at pressure that hasn't detonated yet. That single change in the question moved his entire process back to stage 1, where the actual leverage has always lived, instead of leaving him fighting stage 3 or 4 every single time, which is a fight that compression has already tilted against him before it even begins. This also explains something that confuses a lot of traders about their own history. They'll point to a specific reckless trade and say, "That's where it went wrong," when the honest forensic answer is that the trade was simply where it became visible. The actual failure point, if you want to call it that, was a full week earlier, during a stretch that looked, at the time, like their best trading yet. Treating the visible failure as the real failure is like a fire investigator blaming the flames for the fire instead of tracing back to the faulty wiring that had been sitting there, unnoticed, for months. The flames are just the part everyone happens to be looking at when it finally shows up. And that's the part that should reframe how you think about your own best weeks going forward. A great week that isn't followed by any release, any acknowledgement, any explicit accounting of the urges you suppressed to get there isn't neutral. It's loaded. The traders who avoid this trap long-term aren't the ones who never feel the urge to overtrade. They're the ones who built somewhere for that urge to go that isn't a live position, long before the urge ever shows up looking for one. Anna is still trading her 4 criteria, still writing no trade on the days nothing qualifies, and her account, month over month, looks almost embarrassingly unremarkable on a chart. No spikes, no dramatic drawdowns, just a quiet line moving up. That unremarkable line is what the end of this entire pattern actually looks like, and it's less exciting than anything that happens during a compression phase that hasn't broken yet. It's worth being honest about something here too. Anna still feels the urge sometimes. The compression phase doesn't disappear just because you've built a good process around it. What's different is that the urge now has somewhere specific and immediate to go the moment it shows up, instead of sitting there accumulating silently for a week while everything on the surface looks fine. The difference between her and Daniel was never that she doesn't feel the pull toward an extra trade. It's that her pull gets discharged into a line and a log the same day it appears, instead of getting stored up and discharged 3 weeks later into a session she can barely explain to herself afterward. So here's the actual question worth sitting with after this video ends. Not, will I overtrade tomorrow? That question is aimed at the wrong stage, and you already know it. The real question is whether your best week this month is quietly building pressure right now, with nowhere to go, waiting for a trigger that will feel, when it arrives, like it came out of nowhere.